to our community, of homestays, of immigrants, and we were always having people into our home. And so my mother modeled true civility for us in that way, just transforming the outsider to the insider, the stranger into a friend. I am someone who is constitutionally allergic to authority. I hate rules. I hate being told what to do. And so even though my mother encouraged us to follow these rules of propriety, I always rebelled. And I wondered, why do we have to do these things? Without a sufficiently good reason for why I should do them, I kind of always question them. My mother promised that abiding by the rules of politeness and etiquette would lead to success in work and school and life, and she was right. Until I found myself in government. I served in federal government 2017 to 2018 at a very divided time in our world, in our country. And there, I found everything I thought to be true about myself and the world around me and getting along with others across deep difference, questioned and refuted in many ways. In government, I saw these two extremes. On one hand, I saw people with sharp elbows, people who were willing to do anything, step on anyone to get ahead and gain their objectives, whatever it was. On the other hand, I saw people who at first I thought were my people. They were suave, and they were polished, and they were polite. But I realized quickly these were people who would smile at me and flatter me one moment, and then stab me in the back the next. And that really threw me, because one thing my mother had said growing up was that manners mattered because they were an outward extension of our inward character. And that's part of her whole project of making sure the inner character matches outer conduct. And yet here I was in government, surrounded by people who were well-mannered enough, and yet ruthless and cruel. One time in government, a friend, someone I thought was my friend, a colleague, came up to me and asked for my help with a project. He said, I'm running behind, can you just help me get over the finish line of this project? So I didn't realize that in agreeing to help him, he was asking me to do the whole thing for him, but I did do it. I did do it, and then he passed my work off as his own and went to the meeting and got all the credit for my work. And he, when he made that request, he told me how radiant I looked that day. I was so smart, no one else could help him. And then the moment I did what he wanted and got his project done for him, he never talked to me again. and so that was just very emblematic of this mismatch between inner and outer. The polish and flattery was there when he needed something, but it was gone the next. So that really puzzled me, really hurt me. But I reflected on it, and at first I thought these were two polar opposites, this extreme hostility and this extreme politeness. But I realized they're actually, and in many ways, those two extremes define our public discourse today. There's the extremely aggressive people that are willing to, ad hominem attacks and a scorched earth policy, like we can't negotiate with the enemy, like that kind of hostility on one hand. And then the people that just want to get us to talk nice together. And if we can just talk nice, like that's part of the solution. Or tone policing, like that. So a lot of, in many ways, those extremes define our public discourse. But what I realized was that at first I thought these were opposite, but they were actually two sides of the same coin. Both modes, the extreme politeness and the extreme hostility, instrumentalize others. They see other human beings as means to their selfish ends, as opposed to human beings who are worthy of respect in and of themselves, just by virtue of being human, as members of a human community with equal moral worth to us, who deserve a bare minimum of respect just because they're people. And that experience in government clarified for me this essential distinction between civility and politeness. That politeness is manners, it's etiquette, it's technique, it's behavior, it's external, whereas civility is internal. It's a disposition of the heart. It's a way of seeing other people as our moral equals who are worthy of respect. And that sometimes actually respecting someone, actually loving someone, means being impolite. It means telling a hard truth. It means engaging in robust debate. It means dispensing with the rules of propriety and etiquette for a greater good, which is loving and respecting the other. So that's a core part of my argument of my book, is that there is this essential distinction between civility and politeness, whereas often today, we hear people, there are two main groups. There are people that want more civility and politeness in public life. They harken back to this golden era of gentility and comity. Comity is an old word for for just getting along well with others, and that if we could just get back to civility and politeness, we'd have a better public discourse today. And there's another contingent that says no, politeness and civility are the problem. They are tools of the patriarchy, they're tools of white supremacists, they're tools of people in positions of power to keep the powerless powerless. But both these contingents miss this essential distinction between civility and politeness. Again, politeness is etiquette, it's manners, it's technique, it's behavior, it's external. Civility is internal. It's a way of seeing others as our moral equals, but sometimes it involves being impolite, breaking the rules of propriety to have, for the sake of friendship, this project of human flourishing. There's a reason I wrote my book right now. I experienced firsthand at a micro and observed at a macro level the deep divisions in our world and in our country right now. And I couldn't not write this book. It was, after I left government, it was like a disease, and writing this book was the cure. And I had to do it. And I'm so grateful that it's out here and that you can now enjoy it, which I hope that you do. But as I wrote this book, I realized that this is actually not a new problem. My book is about this question of how do we flourish across deep difference? And this is actually the defining question of a democracy, of the classical liberal project, of the human social project. This is the defining question of our species. As human beings, we are profoundly social. We thrive, we become fully human, we achieve our potential in friendship, in relationship with others. That is why as long as we've been around as a species, we've flocked together, we've come together in relationships and in community and tribes. So we're deeply social as a species. But we're also defined by self-love. Morally and biologically, we are driven to meet our own needs before others. And those two facets of who we are, the social and the selfish, the self-love within us, are intention. And that is why the joint project of living well with others is always fragile. It's as fragile today as it was at the beginning of our species. The oldest book in the world, the oldest story in the world, as I talk about in my book, the Epic of Gilgamesh, illuminates the timelessness of this problem. And I'll leave you to the opening chapter of the book to unpack that. But stories across history, culture, and literature illuminate this idea. I love the story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, for example, Robert Louis Stevenson's novel, where Dr. Hyde is this really prestigious, very illustrious doctor, but he has these baser, darker urges. And he creates this potion that allows him to transform into the evil Mr. Hyde by night and let loose and just act on his base impulses without any repercussions, because he's transformed into this monstrous, deformed Mr. Hyde. And what he learns, and what happens is that the more he indulges that baser part of his self, the more he drinks the potion, the easier it becomes for him to transform into Mr. Hyde. And soon, because he does it so frequently, he transforms into Mr. Hyde spontaneously, and then eventually permanently. I love the story of the Cherokee grandfather who's talking to his grandson one day, and the Cherokee grandfather says, "Grandson, there are two wolves, warring in you, warring in me, every moment of every day. One wolf is hospitable and gracious and benevolent and kind, and the other wolf is malicious and cruel and domineering and unkind." And the grandson says, "Which wolf will win?" And the grandfather says, "Whichever wolf you feed." And that is so true, that with our rituals, with our habits, with our everyday decisions, great and small, those have consequences for the people we become and the societies that we're a part of. And that's a core part of my argument. We insufficiently appreciate the way in which our everyday micro decisions and how we interact with others, nothing is neutral. Everything is an opportunity to affirm and uplift the dignity of the human person, or to debase it, even ignoring someone, choosing not to embrace an opportunity to brighten someone's day when we otherwise might, is taking away is detracting from the joint project of living well with others, detracting from our democracy, detracting from civilization itself. Another thing I learned while writing this book that illustrates the timelessness of this problem is the fact that, did you know, we're at a bookstore here, thank you Daniel for having us, but did you know that the oldest book in the world is a civility handbook? It was written in 2350 BC, given to us from ancient Egypt, written by a gentleman named Ptahhotep. Ptahhotep was someone who had reached the pinnacle of worldly and political success. I don't know if you guys are Hamilton fans, but we are. He had been in the room where it happens his entire life. He was even offered the opportunity to become pharaoh, ruler of the civilized world in ancient Egypt. And he turned it all down in order to retire and have a quiet life of just reflection on everything he had learned. And while he was in retirement, he put pen to paper and sat down to think about the timeless principles of human flourishing. He wrote this book, his Teachings of Ptahhotep, that he meant as a gift for the pharaoh's son in ancient Egypt, hoping that these principles that he had learned throughout his life, and by thoughtfully observing human nature, could benefit the incoming pharaoh's son. And what's incredible is that if you look up the Teachings of Ptahhotep, these 37 maxims are just as relevant today as they were almost 5,000 years ago. They could be in a Judith Martin column, Miss Manners column at the Washington Post. For example, they're just conventional wisdom that we all know to be true, such as don't be good to your friends or your neighbors just when you need something. Be good to them all the time. Don't be cruel to those whom you have power over. Be good and gentle to the vulnerable in your society, in your community. Don't gossip. Ptahhotep has 5 distinct maxims, teachings, prohibiting slander and gossip. And this is, a lot of these are remarkably, there's a remarkable continuity across history and culture in this genre, and these in religious manuals, and ethical manuals, and conduct manuals, that there is this body of wisdom that thoughtful people have observed across history and culture just by studying human nature, studying the human condition, studying what works when it comes to this tough thing, but rewarding thing called society, and what doesn't. And thoughtful people, often sometimes they were influenced by each other. For example, the ancient Greeks loved ancient Egyptian culture, so it's possible that the ancient Greeks, had access to this body of wisdom literature from ancient Egypt. They had access to other Egyptian literature, and of course the Greeks were influential successively. But even independently, people have come to these conclusions time and time again and it's all about restraining the self-love, restraining the ego, so that our social natures can flourish in community. That's what civility is. It's restraining the worst parts of ourselves, the baser parts, the malicious and cruel wolf, reining that in with our everyday habits and rituals and decisions, so we can thrive and become fully human and do this thing called society together. It's an intractable problem. It's a timeless problem, and it's a really difficult problem. It's an important one that we all it's all on our minds, even today. And it can be really hard to know what can be done. It's really easy to look out at the world around us and just see the brokenness and the hurt and the suffering and the division and not knowing what to do. When I moved when I moved to Washington, D.C., my husband and I were living here in Milwaukee just before we moved to Washington. We spent our first year of marriage here in Milwaukee. After being long distance for almost 2 years, and we had just such a wonderful, vibrant community here. And the Zimmermans were such a big part of that. Their kindness, their hospitality to us. We were total strangers. We didn't know anyone here, and they invited us into their home, and they welcomed us into their fold, into their social circle, connected us to other friends. And those were small things, but also big things. They made all the difference in the world to us, and how we found how it wasn't just a place that we lived in Milwaukee. It became home, even though we were just here for a year. And those small but powerful gestures are what make a society flourish. In my book, and I have a chapter on hospitality, and I tell the story of Eumaeus. Eumaeus was a slave servant in ancient Greece. And one day, you may, as a servant, he didn't have a lot in the way of material possessions. But one day, someone who appeared to have even less than he did approached him. He was, a beggar, and he was poor and dirty, and clearly tired and thirsty. And what did Eumaeus do? He welcomed him into his home. He said, "Sit a while, come back, let me clothe you, let me feed you, let me tend to your immediate needs, let me shelter you for the night." And Eumaeus had no idea that this person he was showing hospitality to was actually his long-lost and beloved master, Odysseus. This is a little vignette from Plato's Odyssey. It's such a beautiful story of hospitality, of showing kindness to the stranger. Here's Eumaeus, the one who had nothing, and yet took what little he had and showed kindness to someone who had even less than he did. And this story these stories are so powerful because they illuminate values of the ancient world, and hospitality to the stranger in need was an incredibly high value in the ancient world, and we see this value actually across history and culture. Today, we take for granted how mobile we are as a society. It's relatively easy with credit cards and with airplanes and with cars and a network of hotels to get anywhere relatively affordably, relatively fast. But for most of human history, staying put was the norm, and moving around was atypical because it was so dangerous. It was costly. There were no credit cards. Like, you carried what money you had with you, and if you were robbed, you lost everything. You're stranded. And if you're stranded, you either are reliant on someone's goodwill to take you in, or you die. And so this ethic, this reciprocal ethic of showing kindness to the person in need, was incredibly valuable. It had a purpose, and it's why we find it across history and across culture, because it was necessary. You never knew if you or someone you loved might be shipwrecked and in need of someone else's hospitality someday. So even though it was incredibly vulnerable to let someone into your home, a complete stranger, you did it. You took that risk. The Latin root for hospitality is hospice, and it's the root of both the words both guest and host in Old French and in Old German as well. But the Latin root hospitality, the hospice rather, gives us our word hospitality, but also our word hostile, because that's the duality. There's a duality to our nature, and there's a duality to every single time you show hospitality. It's a risk. Things could either go very well, and it's a bond. You're breaking bread in shared company, and you have a moment in time with someone that becomes a gift for all eternity. All of my favorite memories in life are with friends, around a beautiful meal and good wine and conversation. But you're bonded in mutual vulnerability as well. Having a stranger into your home, going into a stranger's home, that could go very poorly, very badly, and sometimes it did. And in our world today, we are kind of anti-vulnerable. We prefer comfort and safety. I wouldn't say that we're any less hospitable than past eras. I mean, just considering the incredible hospitality that Milwaukee showed my husband and I, the Zimmerman showed our family when we were here almost 10 years ago now, 8 years ago. So it's amazing to believe it's been that long. But there are things in our society, facets of our society, that make it easier to not show hospitality. We're very comfortable. It's really easy to just go through life and not really encounter discomfort or people we don't want to encounter. We go from our homes to our cars to our offices and back again. And sometimes in our world of digital nomads, we don't even have to go out of our house at all. We're not commuting at all. We have our groceries delivered to us. We have Netflix. We have our meals delivered to us. It's really easy to just kind of be siloed and isolated, which is why. But Milwaukee is beautiful. Milwaukee did something different. It showed us a different way of being, our time here, and our church community here. So many people just went out of their way to make us feel welcome and comfortable. And so I know that I'm dismissive of people who say that we're any less hospitable today than we were in past eras. Yes, there are facets of modern life that make it easier to not go above and beyond and outside of our comfort zone to reach out, but people still do it anyways, and it makes all the difference in the world. Again, this is something my mother taught us growing up, modeled for us in our family. And this is something I also learned in Indianapolis, Indiana, when my husband and I moved from Washington, D.C., so we went from Milwaukee to D.C., and then from D.C., I was so dispirited and so despondent at the state of our world and division. We moved to Indianapolis, Indiana. My husband is from Indiana, and I had this beautiful depiction of small town life. Like I loved how the Zimmermans had just they had their little niche. They were involved in things that they cared about, their kids' school. It was just such an inspiring model for us, and I felt so helpless in government. I wanted to have more of an impact, and so we moved to Indianapolis, Indiana, and one of my first friends in Indiana, her name was Joanna Taft. She came up to me one day and said, "Hi, I'm Joanna. Would you like to porch with us sometime?" And I had never heard the word porch used as a verb before. But curious, and also the fact that we didn't know many people in Indianapolis yet, we said, of course. And so we went to her porch that day, and I realized that Joanna is staging a quiet revolution from her front porch. A revolution against our atomized, our divided, our lonely status quo. On her front porch, she had curated people across politics, across race, across geography even. It's really easy just to go, within our little bubbles in our neighborhoods where we feel comfortable and safe. But she had curated this motley crew on her porch, not to have any sort of, structured conversation across difference, just to be together, just to inhabit a shared space, and to build organic friendship and trust across these differences, that maybe after that trust and affection had been built, maybe there was room for conversation across difference. But that's what's so hard about our public life today. We lack that basic trust. We lack that basic affection for the other, for the person that we differ from. We're very quick to see people, essentialize them based on one aspect of who they are, who they vote for, where they grocery shop, where they send their kids to school, what newspaper they read, what color their skin is, as opposed to seeing them in the fullness of who they are as a human being. And Joanna provided on her front porch this place where people could be seen in the fullness of who they are, known and loved. And that is what we all long for as human beings. That's what we pursue relationship for, to feel seen and known and loved. And what I learned from Joanna, just because that to have she uses her porch. That's her tool, her oasis, her mechanism of social change. But you don't need to have a front porch to do that. It's a disposition. It's the disposition of civility. It's a way of engaging with others. The way that I see my mother engage with others, Grant, the way that Sarah engages with others. That it's transforming the outsider to the insider, the stranger into the friend, and that we can all do that. We can do it from our front porch, from our front lawn, from a coffee shop. It doesn't have to be. It's not about what we have. It's a way. It's how we choose to engage with others and with the world around us. So Joanna had never heard of Marcus Aurelius before, but I had, and I realized that there was this beautiful historic symmetry to what was happening, this porching revolution that I saw happening in Indianapolis, Indiana. When Marcus Aurelius was emperor of Rome, he endowed 4 chairs of philosophy. For the Platonists, he endowed the Academy. For the Aristotelians, he endowed the Lyceum. For the Epicureans, he endowed the garden. And for the Stoics, he endowed the Stoa, which is the front porch. And the Stoics, they offered a philosophical answer to a similar time of crisis, existential crisis, of division, of polarization, of just alienation in the Roman Empire. And their answer was, don't focus on what other people are doing. You can't control what others are doing. You can only focus on yourself. And this is what the Stoics said, that if enough people choose to change themselves and how they engage with others in the world around them, that maybe can change the world. And so I loved that unknowingly, unwittingly, like there's nothing new under the sun. That Joanna's doing the exact same thing from her Stoa, from her front porch. She recognizes that she cannot control what's happening in the Middle East, the suffering there. She can't control who's in the White House or what they're tweeting or what the scandal of the day is. But she can control herself, and she is reclaiming ownership of her civic sphere. And she's making her family, her community, her neighborhood stronger and better and more beautiful with what what she has. And we can too. That we insufficiently appreciate the power that we each have in our everyday and just in how we live our lives. In my book, I unpack this idea of the mellifluous echo of the magnanimous soul. This was my grandmother. My grandmother was this extraordinary person. Many of you have not had the privilege of meeting my mother yet. Maybe you will after this talk tonight, but she's just this ebullient, effervescent energy, bundle of energy. And my grandmother was an order of magnitude more intense and just more joy-filled and energetic than even my mother. And my grandmother, she never met a stranger. She was someone who maximized every single human interaction. Every juncture, everyday junctures was just an opportunity. It was a gift to her, a gift of unmerited grace that she didn't deserve. And every person before her was a gift. And she really relished that. She lived every minute. And she perplexed many people. Many people were like, why is this woman talking to me? And what does she want? Like, very skeptical. But she blessed countless more. So often today, our headlines are dominated by stories of generational trauma, of vicious cycles, of one person making selfish and bad decisions that hurt those around them in their immediate circle and then hurt generations that come after them. Less often, though, do we hear stories of the inverse. Stories where one great-souled person, one magnanimous soul, creates with their lives a ripple effect for good, not a vicious cycle, a virtuous cycle. That's what I call the mellifluous echo that reverberates across time and across place. And that was what my grandmother did for us, with her family. She was her family's social glue. She had 5 kids, and one of which was my mother. And each of them went and became the social glue of their family and their community. And then each of them, in turn, raised us according to that otherworldly logic of just sowing seeds of grace and compassion and generosity wherever you go, not knowing what it's going to lead to and not knowing if it will ever, help anyone, but it's just an act of faith and trust that it's good for its own sake. And that she passed away just before my son was born, Percy, who you met earlier. And that everyone there at her funeral was there because she had touched their lives. Like, this was actually just before the pandemic, and there were almost 1,000 people there to celebrate her. And it was just an absolutely appropriate way to celebrate her life and her legacy. And that she was this magnanimous soul who left with with her lifestyle, like her lifestyle of grace and her desire to elevate everyday junctures of human life. She left a mellifluous echo with her life, and that we can too. That this isn't some inaccessible superpower. Although she did have one superpower I'll tell you about. She was absolutely unoffendable. It didn't matter. It didn't matter what you said to her, what you did to her. She faced no end of social affronts where people would just blow off her generosity and kindness. And she would say, that's okay, and on to the next. And it was just remarkable. It's so easy today to bring our wounds to life with others. And the fact is, you never know where people are. And she always had an eye to the thing beneath the thing. That person, blew me off or was really, curt or rude, but I wonder what's really going on. And maybe I even try again another time, Or she just had this amazing thickness and emotional wealth that allowed her to be utterly unflappable and unoffendable. So I call in my book, Unoffendability, the superpower of the 21st century, something I learned from my grandmother. She embodied, this is also a Stoic idea that, we can choose whether we take offense at something. That's on us. Someone else's actions or words can only affect us if we let them. And my grandmother, and my mother too, are just great examples to me of that, of choosing to see, the thing beneath the thing, telling themselves stories that exonerate others, that say, they were really cruel or unkind or thoughtless there, but there's probably an explanation for it. Maybe they're getting a divorce or their mother's sick or something like that. They're having a bad day. That this is about them and that my kindness was good for its own sake, and I'm not going to retaliate, and I'm not going to let that affect me. I'm not going to let it make me less inclined to be gracious to the next person, because it's easy to do that. We bump into others in one instance in our social lives in a way that is grating or deflates us in some way, and it's easy to carry that into the next thing and be like, okay, well, I'm not going to go above and beyond this situation because of what happened there. And my grandmother didn't do that. She just had so much joy and wealth, emotional wealth to give, and she gave, and she made the world a better place in ways that we will never see this side of eternity. I trust that. And I'm grateful to her and to my mother for offering that legacy to me and my cousins and my children as well. It's a legacy that I hope that I imperfectly live up to every day. That's kind of what's vulnerable about writing a book on civility. Like all of a sudden, am I the expert on this? Like, not really. And I hope that the tone I seek to affect throughout the book is that I'm very much a work in progress. And yes, like I think I've distilled some principles from the works of thoughtful people before me that can help us today, but I fall short of them all the time, every minute of every day. It is a battle. It is a battle between the good wolf and the bad wolf within each of us. And but that it does begin, and it can begin and end with each of us, and how we choose to live our every day. And that if enough of us choose to reclaim the soul of civility, that we might be able to change the world. So thank you so much for being here, and thanks to Boswell and to Sarah for facilitating a lovely conversation, and I'd love to hear from you as well. Thank you. Yes?
Thank you so much. Do you happen to have any passages bookmarked that you'd be willing to read?
I'd love to. Of course I would. Yes. Can I borrow your book?
Sure.
Yeah, I'd love to. Maybe I'll pull up. Are these attached, or can I sit on one? Okay. So I'm going to read to you a passage of what I learned from a close rereading of Dr. Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail about civility that are absolutely essential, I think, for why civility as I define it is important for our world today. So while I was in the thick of government, I was just so exhausted. I was absolutely exhausted by these two extremes of like the hostility on one hand and the fake politeness on the other. And it was very much a survivalist kind of season of my life. And I was invited by the Aspen Institute to go to Wide River, Maryland. It was such a reprieve, physically, spiritually, intellectually. It was absent were these two extremes of aggressive hostility and like conniving politeness. And we had really robust conversation across difference. But at the end of the day, we were still friends and we still liked each other. We knew that we were collectively pursuing truth together, and that required robust debate. And that robust debate was informed by our fundamental respect and affection for one another as friends. And so it was while reading Dr. King's letter that I had a kind of an epiphany that clarified for me several things that are now foundational to this book. One of them being the essential difference between civility and politeness. Lessons on civility from Dr. King. In fall of 2017, I joined a group of congressional staffers, civil servants, and political appointees from across the political spectrum on a weekend retreat along Maryland's Wye River at the invitation of the Aspen Institute, a DC-based think tank. The majestic trees, the crisp air, the ripples of the river, and the whispers of the clouds elevated our minds from the mire of Washington and provided an ideal backdrop to our exploration of that weekend's theme: challenges to American civil discourse, past and present. Our country was founded on protest and revolution. Could these modes ever be civil? Is civility always good? Or are there times when departing from civility is justified? And what is civility anyways? The disagreement was honest, fierce, and respectful. Our conversations about big and important ideas were a soul-refreshing reprieve from the survivalism and animosity that defined my day-to-day experience in government. For the first time in nearly a year, I was able to voice my thoughts honestly without fear of offending anyone and making myself a target. It was a breath of fresh air and invigorated my soul. That weekend led me to several realizations about the role of civility and inspired me to write the book that you're now enjoying. As our group discussed Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail, I recognized 3 insights about civility. The why behind civility and our duty to respect others that I had longed for my entire life, and which I had not fully appreciated before then. The letter helped me understand why I was dissatisfied with the 2 extremes of aggressive hostility and duplicitous politeness so pervasive during my service in government. It also reminded me that it wasn't just government that struggled with instrumentalizing others. Doing so was a part of the human condition and could happen within any vocation, in any environment, and in any period of time. First, Dr. King's letter taught me that there is a moral foundation for civility. Treating others with decency, dignity, and respect is non-negotiable because they are our fellow human beings. Dr. King said, now is the time to uplift our national policy from the quicksand of racial injustice to the solid rock of human dignity. When discussing the evils of racial segregation, Dr. King invoked Martin Buber's I-it and I-thou distinction. It is wrong to use others, to either be willing to step over them or to manipulate them, which is what politeness does, because this treats a person, a thou, as though they were a thing or an it. Why? Because, as Dr. King said, human beings share an irreducible, equal moral worth. We have dignity, as Dr. King noted, which is why he dedicated his life to creating a world without the evils of racism, and in which, quote, all men will respect the dignity and worth of human personality. Dr. King's words helped me realize that the defining ethos of my time in government was instrumentalizing others, seeing them as means to end as opposed to beings with dignity and moral worth in and of themselves. But this tendency is not unique to politics or DC. It can surface anywhere, anytime, because it emerges from part of the human personality that we all share. Human dignity was the moral bedrock for Dr. King's battle against racism. It is also the moral foundation for civility in any environment of human flourishing. The 2 extremes of aggression and faux niceness, present during my time in government and in our public life more broadly, corrode human dignity because they instrumentalize human beings, treating them as its and not thous. Those who are hostile and demeaning to others see people as mere means or obstacles to their ends to be degraded and discarded along the way. Those who weaponize politeness, putting a polished exterior over malicious intent, view human beings as pawns to be manipulated. We must recover Dr. King's view of personhood and human dignity, a way of looking at others that sees them as ends in themselves, worthy of our respect. Dr. King's philosophy of personhood helps us recover the moral foundation of civility, the basic duty we have to all people, including those who are unlike us, who we may not agree with, and those who cannot do anything for us in return. Second, in the same way that there are just and unjust formal laws, there are just and unjust informal laws or social norms, including manners and mores. Dr. King's letter offers us a litmus test for how to distinguish between just and unjust laws. A just law is one that uplifts human personality, while an unjust law degrades it. As Dr. King writes, all segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority and the segregated a false sense of inferiority. His framework also applies to norms of civility and can help us to distinguish between just and unjust informal social norms. To paraphrase Dr. King, any norm that uplifts human personality is just, while any norm that degrades it is unjust. A just social norm is rooted in eternal and natural law. Social norms that divide or silence or oppress or distort the soul of human personality ought to be discarded. Our task is to continue Dr. King's work, elevating social norms that affirm the dignity of the human person and human personality, and affirm the unity of the human community and the human race, devaluing norms that degrade human personality. King knew that not all laws, formal or informal, were equal, and that even laws formed with good intent could be applied in unjust ways. I found this to be true in government when I saw people using norms of common decency and courtesy as a means of disarming and undermining others. Even well-intentioned norms can be applied in ways that instrumentalize others and therefore can be harmful. The motivation behind our compliance with social practices matters. It can transform a just law or norm into an unjust one. Blindly following hard and fast rules, like unthinkingly following the blind instrument of law, is not enough to promote justice and can sometimes lead to injustice. Our loyalty must be to the bedrock of human dignity, the moral foundation of all just formal and informal social laws. I'll leave it there and let you hopefully buy the book so you can keep reading. But yeah, thank you. I'd love to take questions. Yes.
It sounds like you had a very bad experience during your time working in government. When you were there strategies that you were able to use to sort of cancel out the negativity of the people around you who were behaving in hostile or in phony ways?
Yeah, it's a great question. While I was in government, I think one thing that made it even harder was that I hadn't read this book yet, and I insufficiently appreciated I had more power over my own mind and how I responded to the situation than I realized. In the moment, I felt really helpless. I felt really stuck. I saw these two extremes, and I felt like I just can't win. Like I'm not willing to, be aggressive and hostile, or to manipulate others through politeness. But I did see these were the two tracks that people generally use to succeed, and I saw that the one most suited to success was niceness and politeness, and so I tracked hard in that direction. I didn't manipulate others, but I thought, I wanted to be so likable that I could never be fired or undermined. I wanted to be, taken out of that orbit of competition. So I did all the things. I brought in Easter cards and Christmas cards for all of my colleagues. I invited them to my home for dinner and for cocktails, and I took them to lunch outside of the office in hopes of getting to know them on like a human level outside of the office context. I brought in cupcakes for people's birthday. Who could hate people who bring in cupcakes, right? That was my strategy. And I failed, it didn't work. There were still some people who were, dead set on winning, and so that felt really exhausting though, because looking back, I realized that was a survival tactic. Even though those things were generous and gracious and good and were very much in how I was raised to be hospitable and kind. They're and we still do those things. We still have people over for dinner. We still do Christmas cards. I still bake cakes for friends' birthdays. But the motivation was survival. It was about me wanting to be too liked. It wasn't about serving others as it could have been. That felt really exhausting. It felt like there was this sort of cognitive dissonance that felt really depleting. I was still fearing for my life every single day. And so looking back, what would I do differently? One thing I learned from Dr. King that I didn't unpack in the section I just read to you was, he makes an argument that segregation is mutually harmful. He says that segregation distorts the personality and the soul of both the segregated and the segregator by giving the segregated a full sense of inferiority and the segregator a full sense of superiority. And the same is true for incivility, that it's mutually harmful, that it deforms the soul of the person to whom one's cruel, and it deforms the person who is cruel too. It makes us less human and less humane. When we hurt someone, we're hurting ourselves too. We insufficiently realize that. And so today, in our world of really high stakes, political rhetoric and discourse, where we hear leaders on both sides of the political spectrum, and we probably even know people on both sides of the political spectrum that feel like all bets are off, and the other side is too bad and too wrong to be reasoned with or to be respected. And what we, as a society, insufficiently realize is that when we have that sort of scorched earth attitude towards others, we're not just hurting others, like we're hurting ourselves too. When we harm another human being, we are so deeply interconnected. Like we become less human and less humane. Just as Dr. Jekyll did, the more he fed his inner Hyde, the more he became Hyde. I reference in my chapter 1 of my book a work by St. Augustine, very famous philosopher, St. Augustine of Hippo, called The City of God. And he has this phrase called the libido dominandi, and this is the bad wolf within us, that it's the lust to dominate that is within every single human person. And it's a play on words in the Latin, that the more we indulge the libido dominandi, the lust to dominate, it becomes the dominating lust. We become more Mr. Hyde. That's exactly the story that Robert Louis Stevenson and the Cherokee story of his grandfather is telling. Like, you become the bad wolf the more you feed that wolf as well. And so, what would I have done differently? I would have had more hope that me doing the right thing for its own sake was its own reward. That we hear a lot today that you can't succeed unless you're willing to go all the way and do all the things and go scorched earth, that nice guys finish last. But, I think people insufficiently realize that the cost of winning is at the cost of our own soul, our own humanity, and our own humaneness. And that us choosing to have boundaries of decency and courtesy and humanity for others, even those that we might disagree with or think are misguided, that it's both an inherent, it's an inherent good. Like, we're affirming our own humanity and theirs. It's mutually ennobling, it's mutually beneficial. So it's its own reward. Yes?
I wish I had been prepared to take notes. There were so many points that you made that I wish I could share experience and follow up with and ask you about. So thank you for that. That was amazing. But one of the first things to think about is the north versus the south.
Yeah.
U.S. Southern U.S. And one of the things I struggled with is moving from the south to the north was the hospitality in the south. And the fact that you made eye contact with every stranger, straight conversation with every stranger. And like, you use the term emotional love, there's a lot more than that. And one of the things I struggled with coming to the West was kind of not having that. That was not the norm. It was very part of the Southern culture. But when you look at things like the racism in the South, which still exists, which KKK is marching 45 minutes from where you are. That's the other side of this. When you put out the light on civility, you just know that the Midwest is people are civil, but there's that segregation, that culture, where that side is fed, where you're kind of celebrating differences. So, I don't know, I'm just curious your thoughts. Have you ever thought about this in terms of the region?
Of course, it's a great observation that you've experienced firsthand. That on one hand, there's a warmth in the South of, you greet your new neighbors with cookies, you do the gestures. But have you ever heard the phrase, bless your heart? Like, that is they don't really mean bless your heart. Like you're an idiot, you know. Like talk about politeness, right? But not civility. You know, it's very condescending. And I'm very skeptical of claims that dismiss regions, people group, historical epochs in broad swaths, right? Like when we talk about North versus South, like I think it's more helpful, it's helpful to recognize that, you know, this doesn't apply to everyone, you know, like that but culturally, like I think that there are claims to be made that there is this veneer of politeness and hospitality, and that goes back, that can belie condescension and cruelty and racism. That goes back historically during and after the Civil War. And before the Civil War, the Southerners had a really robust self-construction of this culture of manners and gentility and chivalry. They loved, for example, King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. And they had coats of arms, these plantation owners. And they even revived the joust. They would literally, you know, joust on horses. Like there was a really clear, like, self-conception of wanting that they were, you know, the lords and ladies of King Arthur's Round Table. And yet, despite those mores and exterior trappings of, you know, chivalry and gentility, this was a culture that subjected a subset of human beings, right, and treated them as property. And so that I think is a great distinction between civility and politeness. Like that politeness, you can have the gestures of trappings and of refinement, of gentility and chivalry, without the fundamental respect of personhood that civility demands, requires. And in fact, after the Civil War, there was concern that the South, after the South had lost, could not be reintegrated into America, into the Republic, because the culture of slavery had so deformed the souls of slave owners that they had become so used to subjecting another human being over because they owned slaves, that they were all little tyrants, and they weren't fit for self-governance, and they weren't fit for life in a democracy that required a well-proportioned, ordered soul. We couldn't have a society of Southern tyrants as part of a democracy. And I think what's so interesting about that is that was a real debate, but that also, that idea illuminates so many important ideas in my book, that, you know, when we harm others, it doesn't harm others only, it hurts us too. That even if no one sees it, even if it's quote unquote consequence free, in some ways it has the highest consequences, because it's at the cost of our humanity and our humaneness too. One more? Okay. Yes, sir.
Is there anything that you're consciously teaching your children to do differently than your mom taught you?
Oh, that's a great question.
I'm listening.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So one thing I do with my kids, I'm much more fluent with telling my kids no than I think my mom was with us growing up. I mean, so civility requires telling others hard truths. It requires having respect for others. Requires us being willing to risk offending, hurting someone's feelings because we love them enough to make them aware of something they should know. But civility also requires respect for ourselves too, and that requires saying no. It requires having boundaries. It requires, you know, saying no to someone. Doesn't mean that you hate them. It means that, you know, like, I want to protect this friendship, and I need to protect myself, and I don't want to say yes and resent you for it later. And so that's actually a loving thing to do. And we're in our society today, we're incredibly skeptical of saying no, and we don't want to offend people, and we overextend ourselves as a result, and it builds up resentment. It's not good for anyone. But I am very I apply that in my, like, how I parent with my kids, that saying no to them, having strict boundaries with my children, disciplining them, that's a way that I love them, that I express. It's like knowing that they can know, they can trust my authority. Another thing I do is that I'm quick to have my kids, like, practice serving one another. Like, my son will say, "Mom, can I have some milk?" And I'll give him the milk, and I'll say, "First, offer it to your sister." Like, it just, like, getting that, and he'll offer it to her, and then baby girl will have a sip, and then I'll say, "Sophia, offer it to your brother. And then Sophia will say, after you, Percy, and just like to practice, like to have service be second nature. That's something I'm trying to inculcate, because our self-love is so pernicious, and it's like gravity. It's like default. It's like, it is our default nature to just want to serve ourselves first. But I think a service I can do for my kids is to inculcate in them early on just habits of service that get them in the I'm gonna think of others before myself, because it's so easy to think of ourselves. So even though baby girl's under 2 and Percy's 4, just like having them be fluent in that language and practice of service. So.
And she's a great mom.
Thank you. Thanks for that question. That's fun. All done?
I think
Okay.
Well done.
Thank you.
we have copies of the book at the front desk. That's over there, front desk. If you want to take a look at it before you purchase it, just ask the bookseller. But you do have to purchase it before you get it signed. Our author will be at the table down this aisle. And so please do me a favor and clear this space so we can put it back together for browsing again and before the store closes. I want to thank you for a wonderful afternoon, and thank all of you for coming. We wouldn't have a bookstore without you. And even if you're not buying a book right now, we also have bookmarks to give out for everyone.
Yes.
So please stop by the desk, say hello, and take a bookmark. Maybe one for, I think we have enough for one for a friend as well.
Yes.
So,
And thank you so much for supporting a local bookstore, supporting
Woo!
a once local bookstore. It's hard work, and it's arduous work, and well, I'll tell you a funny story. Like, it was a lot of work writing a book, and a lot goes into like energy around publication day. So my book came out last Tuesday, October 10th. So it's still like a hot off the presses, like new release. And I go into a bookstore on Tuesday on publication day, and I went in to look for my book. It was at Barnes & Noble. I'm sorry.
I've heard they're around.
I was, yeah, exactly. And my book was
New York City.
New York City, yeah. I was in New York for publication. My book was nowhere to be found. And I asked them, they're like, oh, it looks like we have 2 copies. Like, check the basement. So this is my publication day. So I go into the basement, I find my book, like, hidden on like a shelf back here. And I take them up and I take them to the manager. I was like, hi, like, I'm the author. This is my publication day. I'd like to sign these books. And she goes, oh, okay, no problem. She gives me a Sharpie, and I take them over and I, sign these books, and they give me these little stickers signed by the author. And I'm like, okay, well, that was underwhelming, but I'll walk out. And then, as I'm walking out, a security guard stops me and says, excuse me, I noticed you writing in those books. Are you going to buy those? I was absolutely mortified. And the manager comes over and is like, oh no, she's the author. So all that to say, support a local indie, support a once local author, and thank you for considering buying the book, and give it to a friend if you want. But yeah, thank you so much for being here.